Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on conflict resolution. First of all, some introductions. So we have myself, Sue Watson. I'm the HR Operations Manager at HR Solutions. I'm accompanied by Victoria, our HR Knowledge Manager, who many of you will have heard before. And also we're very pleased to welcome Kelly Barfoot, who's a trained mediator and who's going to do the section for us on mediation services. We also have a team working in the background, fielding any technical challenges you may have. So our agenda today is looking at understanding conflict, what it is, how you can resolve it, and one of the options available to you to resolve conflict on mediation. We encourage you to ask questions during the webinar. We have had to mute you all because there are so many people attending this one, it wouldn't be practical, but we do want to hear your questions. The way to raise them is you should have a chat panel that looks something like this. If you submit your question to us, I will field them at the end of the webinar and we will ask them live to the team here. If you have any other technical problems, also use the chat panel and we'll try and deal with them through there for you. We do want to make this session as interactive as we would normally at our physical events, so we will be running a series of polls throughout the session as well. When we have a poll, it will appear on your screen with this slide and you just select the answer that's appropriate for you. Please note that to be able to participate in the polls, you do need to ensure your screen is not in full screen mode. So I'm now going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to take us through the first part of this webinar.
Thank you, Sue. Just want to make sure you're all seeing my screen. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you, Sue, and good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all, and especially to Kelly, who is joining us today to co-run our webinar. So today's webinar is about conflict resolution with a particular focus on mediation. As we know, the last few months have been extremely challenging to both business and employees. Consequently, there's a lot of change taking place at the moment, with many employers restructuring themselves and making redundancies. We need to therefore help and support our employees who may be feeling disgruntled, frustrated, or even angry as a result of decisions that are having to be taken. So we'll begin our webinar by understanding more about conflict, what it is and how it can impact both employers as well as employees. I'll then talk at high level through ways in which we can look to prevent and resolve, before I then hand over to Kelly, who will then focus on mediation and how this can help you and your employees. So first of all, it's important to understand conflict before we go on to look into detail about mediation and other ways of resolving it. So conflict not just impacts the employee, but it can also impact the business. Conflict is where there is a difference of opinion between people, which can be positive or negative. And examples where it can be positive in the workplace, for example, could be where you may wanting to be gathering views on how to progress a project, when you're working collaboratively together on defining a company strategy. You know, they're all examples of where it can work positively. However, it is also negative. And of course, that's the main focus of today. Negative conflict can come about from several different causes, such as one-off disagreements, personality clashes, ongoing difficult relationships, poor management, ambiguous job roles, poor communication and unfair treatment. And the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development early this year did carry out some research and have published their findings in a report that's called Managing Conflict in the Workplace. Now everybody will get a copy of the slides afterwards, so there'll be a link there for you. So if we look at conflict from the employee perspective and from the research that was carried out by the CIPD, they identified from their findings that conflict can lead to stress, anxiety and depression, unworkable relationships, as well as demotivation. The CIPD research found that of the respondents, stress was actually the biggest impact and that was at 48%, followed by anxiety at 36%. We also have depression at 22% of respondents saying that that was an impact for them, and unworkable relationships being at 20%, and feeling demotivated, 40% of respondents confirmed that as part of the research. So you can clearly see that conflict in the workplace can have a detrimental impact for the employee. Now, looking at it from the organisation's point of view, and again from the same research carried out by the CIPD, as you'll see on this illustration, the conflict can lead to sickness absence, reduced productivity, behavioural issues, disciplinary matters, and of course grievances. And what you'll see is 19% of the respondents identified that it actually had a detrimental impact on employees' productivity. So it's also important to highlight that given these challenging times, you know, when we're trying to manage that return to the workplace after lockdown, if it's not managed carefully, then there is potential for conflict arising out of the whole COVID pandemic, because for many organisations, they are having to make difficult decisions, they are having to adapt to change very quickly, which can cause tensions in the workplace if not managed appropriately. So, for example, if we think about COVID, conflict can arise at this point in time as a result of organisations having to make redundancies, you know, including, you know, who it is that's been selected, who you keep on furlough and who do you bring back to the workplace. Then there can also be conflict that arises just by, you know, you're doing everything you can to make the workplace safe. But there may be some employees that perhaps don't feel satisfied with that. So they may feel there's some conflict that arises just by what you're trying to do to help make that workplace secure. Managing business needs as well can, along with employees' challenging personal circumstances, can also be an opportunity for conflict to creep in, because, you know, we are at a time where we're trying to manage and support employees that may have childcare challenges, they may have caring responsibilities, you know, and, you know, we're seeing all these local lockdowns and a lot of disruption still going on, and at the same time businesses trying to rebuild. So it comes back to like your decision making and how that's managed. So that can be an avenue for conflict arising. And of course we also have the scenario of with COVID about people that are leaving the country and then returning, and the whole quarantine piece, and, you know, businesses are having to make decisions and difficult decisions about how they then manage that pay for people. So there's a number of different challenges at the moment on top of the normal business as usual challenges that we're having to deal with. So before we move on to looking at several ways in which we can resolve conflict, we're going to run a few polls. So I'm going to hand over to Sue, and we'll just run a couple of polls here.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So the first poll I'm going to launch is, which of the following do you think is the main cause of workplace conflict in your organisation? I think most people are voting now. Just give it a couple more seconds.
Oh, interesting what's coming through.
Yeah. Right, I'll close that poll now and I'll share the results with you.
Yeah.
So there we go.
Yeah.
Top two quite streets ahead of the others, really. And surprisingly, not furlough. I guess that's past. Yeah. Might have been earlier on in the year, but perhaps not now.
Yeah. And I guess these two top points here, you know, they can happen at any time. It's not necessarily relevant to COVID, is it? And decisions that are having to be taken around that. So I think, you know, mediation isn't just about now at this point in time. It should always be embedded in, you know, organisations as recognised as a way in which we can look to resolve conflict. But yeah, so that's interesting that there's a fairly sort of equal split between those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll progress to the next one, which is digging a little bit deeper. So where you have observed conflict in your organisation, how have you seen it affect the employee? A lot of people voting at the moment. I'll just leave that a few more seconds. Okay, I think we're just about there.
Interesting.
I'll close that one and share the results. They're quite close, really.
Yeah. That is interesting, and I think if we think back to the CIPD, the top main impact of it is your stress, and I think that that's telling, and obviously it's showing at peers. Well, it's the second highest, but nevertheless it's high.
Absolutely. And so when we have one final poll at this section, I just hide that one and open this one. So where you have observed conflict in the organisation again, but it's what impact has it had on the employer this time, not just the employee. I think we're nearly there now. Okay, I'll close that poll and share the results.
Okay.
That's also akin to the general statistics from the survey, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think overall it shows, whatever the root cause, conflict is a disruption, isn't it? And a distraction for business. And as we can see here, productivity, and especially at a time when we're trying to rebuild and reorganize ourselves, in this new world and of way of working. So certainly, definitely, conflict is something that should be on our agenda, if you like, to look to try and resolve and prevent. But that's interesting. And 16% grievances.
Yeah.
Which
definitely.
they're
An
all
increase in
major
those, isn't there? Sorry.
Yeah,
we've seen a significant increase in the number of grievances that we're supporting clients with at the moment, compared with the norm. Usually appeals to processes that are going on, whether it be restructure or redundancies, and then they've got sort of more complaints about the whole thing, become very disgruntled. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sue.
So I'll hide that. Back to you.
Thank you. So now we're going to just, before we actually spend time on mediation, I'm just going to, at high level, just look at resolving conflict in other ways. So very often dealing with negative conflict is reactionary to a situation. But it should be about creating a culture that actually can prevent it. Building an inclusive culture is important. So we would suggest that to help build that inclusive culture, think about having that understanding about your employees as people and as individuals, and by knowing their own working style as well as what may be happening outside of work, gives you that insight and that better understanding of that person for when you then interact, communicate and work with them. We would also say identify where there may be conflict or tensions in the team, so you could be already picking up and observing this. And so it's about being proactive to actually drive positive relationships. Try and think of how you can encourage collaboration and teamwork, and really focus on that. And obviously just keep an eye on it if you are observing it, because when you may need to intervene with other measures, then you should do so. If we think about conflict, some of it can come back to ambiguity in terms of the job role, where the organisation is heading to, objectives. So really setting clear goals and objectives is going to be really important moving forward, and setting those realistic timescales so that the individuals on the team can feel like they are working within their capacity and are able to meet the demands that's put on them. And set out clearly your own expectations in terms of, how people treat each other, how you interact, the general conduct and standards of work, because by doing that, it's you're almost preempting anything, and you're trying to prevent things from happening. And leading by example, I always say, is a really important strategy, because people should follow and observe how you're behaving, and so leading by example is a good way in terms of demonstrating what behaviours you're expecting in the workplace. And as I said, encouraging team working and collaboration is really important, and welcome everybody's contribution, and maintain privacy and confidentiality of your team members' personal matters. Remain objective and act consistently in the decision makings that you take, and where there are workplace issues, then explore those early and thoroughly. So from my point of view, I truly believe the key to resolving conflict is having that effective communication. So being able to effectively communicate can resolve misunderstandings, can help to ensure people feel as though they've been listened to, and that they've also been treated seriously and fairly. And it can help you get to the root cause of a particular issue. So communication is invaluable, because if you can get to that root cause of an issue, you can then take the necessary steps to nip the matter in the bud and stop things from escalating. Taking action to resolve conflict is a fundamental part of the line manager's role. As line managers, having the skills and confidence to intervene early to address minor disagreements, to prevent escalation or issues festering, then the better the work environment will be. And so having a better environment will lead to a more engaged workforce, which will ultimately lead to more performance, and have that will hit the bottom line positively. So it is really important to ensure that day to day, should, as part of a line manager's role, you're looking at managing and resolving conflict. Being aware of what is going on within your team is also crucial, not just for effective performance, but for employee engagement. And if you do believe there's a problem in the team, being proactive and initiating informal discussions between the parties will be key. Letting matters fester and escalate will only lead to feelings of resentment, stress, which can also lead to sickness absence and even formal grievances. So in terms of grievances, then as you'll know, under the every organisation, as per ACAS, are required to have a grievance policy, and the ACAS Code of Practice on Disciplinary Grievance recommends that employees should settle most grievances informally with their line manager first. Employees should make every effort to resolve the conflict informally, and the grievance process should therefore take place if that informal approach can't resolve the matter, or if it's too serious that you need to go to that formal process. But there are occasions where, as I say, it's appropriate to go to the formal grievance, and that could be where you've got conflict such as allegations coming up about discrimination, allegations of bullying and harassment, or even if the employees requested the matter be formally investigated. We then have mediation, and ACAS does encourage employers to consider mediation. And in their code of practice, they say that employers and employees should always seek to resolve disciplinary and grievance issues in the workplace. And where that's not possible, consideration should be given to using an independent third party to help resolve the problem. So what we're going to do now is spend some time on this webinar actually focusing on mediation, and understand what it is, the benefits, how it works. And so I'm going to be handing over to Kelly so that we can find out more from our expert on mediation. But I do believe we've got some polls first. So let's just look to see how we can look at the polls.
Okay, if you move on, it's okay.
Yeah.
I will launch the first poll,
Brilliant.
which is, have you been aware of conflict? There we go. Of conflict between people in your organisation in the last 12 months? I think nearly everybody's voted now. I'll close that poll and share the results. So wow, 89%. Yes, I think that's a resounding.
Wow, yes.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And it
Score.
has been a difficult 12 months, hasn't it?
It has, definitely. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So I just move down to the next one, which is, in your opinion, has lockdown increased or decreased interpersonal issues at your organisation? This one's switched between the two throughout as people are voting. So which way is it going to go finally?
Oh, wow.
Ooh, one just edging ahead now. Right, I'll close the poll and share the results with you.
Wow. So that's so lockdown has decreased interpersonal issues at your organisations. That's interesting.
And I guess not surprising in some ways, because if they're not actually physically in the same location,
Yeah.
then if it is between two people, then it perhaps means because they're apart, there's been less opportunity.
Yeah, interaction.
Conflict.
Exactly.
But yeah.
But I guess the question then that may come up then is around when people are back working together, when we're you know, back in the workplace and we're probably operating a bit more normal to what we have been. It'll be interesting to see how those issues are dealt with, if they you know, what happens with those issues. Yeah.
Okay, and then there's one more poll. I think this is the last poll for today. Is, have you ever used mediation in your workplace? Okay, a few more votes popping in now. Okay, I'll close that poll and share the results with you.
Okay, fairly split again.
Yeah, fairly even, that one. So roughly half of you have and half of you haven't. So interesting. So over to you, Kelly, perhaps to enlighten us all on the whys and wherefores of mediation.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Sue, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. So I'm trying to swap the slides, Sue, and it's not moving along.
Okay. Is it not moving on? Yep. You want to try once more?
Yeah, it's not moving along.
It's not moving on. I can control them for you if you like.
If you would, it should be fairly self-explanatory as we go along.
Okay. Let me just take that back. Sorry, everybody. Okay, I think we're back on. There
That's
we go.
It. Great. That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. So we're going to have a bit of a go through mediation and give you a good understanding of how the process works and all of the insider information, really. So if you think about how much time you spend at work over your lifetime, it's really not surprising that most people encounter a problem at some point. So I want to start with defining what mediation is. So mediation is a confidential and informal process whereby an independent third party, of course, though it can also be internal mediation, but I'm going to focus on external mediation. They work with people who are having a disagreement, and the aim is to help people find their own way forward, to reach their own agreement, to resolve their issues, and to thoroughly explore what went wrong in order to stop it happening again in the future. So a typical mediation process takes 1 day if there are 2 people involved in the dispute. Mediation can take place between 2 individuals, but also a whole team, perhaps. So it can be 2, 3, 4. I've even mediated disputes involving 14 people. Of course, this does take slightly longer than just 1 day. There's no guarantee, though, with the mediation. It may not necessarily be successful. However, if the parties are willing to take part, then a positive outcome is likely. So let's have a look at some of the mediation rules. If Sue can just swap the slide. Thank you. So we need to understand what the formal processes are around mediation. So mediation is voluntary. Employees don't have to do it, and they are informed within the mediation that they can stop it at any time, as can the mediator. The details of the mediation discussions remain completely and absolutely confidential. You, as the employer, you won't know what happened. The confidentiality is such an important part of the credibility of the mediation process, and this is made very clear to the parties involved because they need to trust that the mediator isn't going to report back to their manager or to HR on what was said, and also that the other person involved in the mediation isn't going to go and tell everybody what happened. No legal advice is given by the mediator within mediation. This wouldn't be appropriate. The mediator also doesn't take sides or pass any judgment on who is right or who is wrong. It's not their role to decide this within the situation. The purpose of the mediation is to agree how to move forward. However, I will let you know that if there is something which was blatantly not okay, for an example, swearing at a team member, something like that, then the mediator may well express that as an opinion. The mediation agreement, if one is reached, is morally binding and not legally binding. So when parties reach agreement in mediation, they must be 100% happy with what they agreed to so that they can commit to it. A good amount of time is spent during this part of the mediation because the mediator really needs to check out the reality of the agreements made. Then they must make sure that only workable solutions are included. So, for example, we can't come away from a mediation with an outcome that 2 people, 2 colleagues, just will never speak to each other again. This wouldn't be practical in the workplace. So the mediator is always looking at what's actually going to work, what's going to be realistic, and what's going to help them long term. So let's have a discussion about what happens before mediation takes place. Now, I'm a person who likes detail, so I really wanted to set out exactly what happens before and during a mediation. So prior to the mediation, the mediator will usually ask for an overview of what has happened between the parties. However, the mediator is very unlikely to want to read through all the grievance and disciplinary and investigation documentation because this may risk bias. It's far better if the parties tell the mediator in their own words. It can also be a cathartic experience for the person to tell everything all over again to a new pair of ears. And that can also benefit the mediation later on by taking some of the heat out of the discussion if there is any. The mediator will provide an information sheet for the parties to read prior to mediation. This gives them lots of information on the process and answers a few frequently asked questions. It can also be read by the managers as well, the employees' managers. Anyone is welcome to read that document. It just makes sure that everybody understands what they're getting into, and the mediator will go over this again during the mediation meeting. The rules around mediation just can't be emphasised enough. And if necessary, the mediator can answer questions on the mediation process prior to the mediation by email or phone, perhaps. And the reason for this is because the mediator wants to remove any barriers to the mediation. So it can be helpful to just ask a few of those questions beforehand and put people's mind at ease really because the mediation is such a great opportunity for getting things sorted out. It would be such a shame if somebody missed out on it because of a lack of understanding or misconception about what would happen. The majority of mediation that I happen to carry out tends to take place on the organisation's own site, only so long as there's a private meeting room away from the usual place of work. I'm sure you can imagine it wouldn't be helpful to the mediation process if colleagues could overhear the conversations or be able to look through the windows and see what was going on. But some people find it preferable to book an external meeting room for the day, and that also works well. So during the mediation is an informal process. However, there's a good deal of formality in terms of the correct process and the facilitation that it involves. So let me go through what's going to happen during the mediation. So the mediator is going to meet individually with each party separately, and I want to understand their perspective on the situation during that. It's essential that both parties have an allowance for equal individual time with the mediator, and that normally takes 1.5 to 2 hours, that's usual. This meeting, again, is completely confidential, and actually the person may say things to the mediator in the individual meeting that they don't want to bring up in the joint meeting, and the mediator will hold that confidence. The mediator needs to understand each person's view, their perspective, but also what they want to get out of the mediation and how they see the situation being resolved. This element of the mediation process should not be shortchanged. You have to put the time in to the individual meeting. It helps parties to prepare for the joint meeting and helps them get everything off their chest prior to seeing the other person, because perhaps if they've been off sick or perhaps during lockdown, they may not have seen them for several months. So before the joint mediation meeting, if the parties are okay to go ahead, a mediation agreement is signed. The mediator retains this document. I happen to keep them for 2 years and then shred them. And it sets out all the conditions of mediation, such as the confidentiality, the voluntary aspect, all of these things. And it confirms that the parties understand this. The mediator will then bring the parties together for the joint mediation meeting. This is probably the most pivotal part of the mediation, and it must be handled with care. The mediator will acknowledge if the parties haven't seen each other for a while, perhaps if someone's been off sick with stress or anxiety due to the conflict, and the mediator will settle the parties into the discussion by making some introductions, explaining the process. There'll be some ground rules set. For example, they might be around honesty, owning what is said, listening, acknowledging and explaining rather than defending, and the aim of this is to enable the parties to get the best out of the mediation. The discussion in mediation can be a bit odd at times, if I'm honest with you. So for example, the mediator might stop and start the discussion, need to ensure that parties have heard key points and emphasise any issues that are missed by either person. It's a really open and honest discussion. It's a real privilege to be part of, really. The parties are encouraged to take a no stone left unturned approach, because in my experience, if any stones are left, then they tend to fester and the issues are just not fully resolved and they'll crop up again in the future. Discussions can be emotional, they can be heated, although this is thoroughly controlled by the mediator as to what is acceptable. And there can be something of a roller coaster, and people will certainly feel quite tired after taking part in mediation, that's for sure. The joint mediation meeting does usually take a good 3 to 4 hours. Again, it shouldn't be shortchanged because the investment of time at this point will give you a stronger and long-lasting resolution. Any notes taken during the mediation are shredded at the end. And if a mediation agreement is reached, it's strictly confidential and personal to the two parties involved. It's that way so that they are committed to it, and more importantly, it will work for them. It's a very live document. It's handwritten by the mediator in the session, the mediation agreement. And in some cases, it is relevant to share that document with a trusted third party. However, both parties have to consent to this, and if one of them doesn't, then it can't be shared. In the same way that if any actions or key points that come out of the mediation, they can only be communicated back to the employee if both parties consent. The mediator doesn't keep a copy of the written agreement. That's for the parties involved only. And as frustrating as I know it is, the mediator can only report back to the employer that agreement was or was not reached. You don't learn any of the details from the discussion. The mediator is quite adept at saying a few things but without saying anything. So they may well say to you that the discussion was full and productive, but this really is as much as you would get. So let's have a look at mediation uses. So we can use mediation in a number of places. Although there's no specific rule about when it must be used, it's got relevance at all of the different stages. So we can look to use mediation perhaps even before a grievance is raised, in the early stages of a grievance or as an outcome, after a grievance has been closed, after disciplinary action, or in the lead up to an employment tribunal or afterwards if the party or parties remain in employment. A forward-thinking organisation looks to use mediation before a formal grievance has even been raised. It really is the case that conflict is best nipped in the bud. So if there are rumblings of issues, then the mediation is usually faster and more successful the earlier it's done. That being said, there are many situations that absolutely should be dealt with formally through the grievance or disciplinary procedures. And if the people remain employed after formal action has been taken, then mediation is an excellent step to include to ensure that the working relationships are okay going forward and no grudges are held. And if the mediation is not successful, it can still be beneficial to the organisation because it shows, if you need to show, that you've done everything possible to try and remedy the situation. So let's have a look at mediation benefits. So using an external mediator avoids conflict of interest and promotes absolute confidentiality. It really does say to the employee that the information will go no further because they won't see that mediator again. Employees may feel able to say more to an external person that they won't see again. In my experience, the mediator does hear all kinds of sensitive information, as people do find it easier to open up to someone that they're not going to see again. An external mediator has true impartiality with no risk of biasing future procedural action because they would not be involved in hearing any further grievances or disciplinaries because they don't work for your organisation. It does show the employer's commitment to take resolution of conflict seriously. It takes things up a level in the eyes of the employees. They can see that their conflict is being taken seriously and that an investment is being made by their company to put things right. An external mediator is doing mediations all the time, so they have the expertise and the experience. And mediation is quick to arrange in terms of, if you think about how much time it can take to investigate and hear and report on a grievance or disciplinary, then if there is an option to do that informally, mediation can save a lot of time. And less stressful, of course. So if mediation is successful, it can reduce staff turnover, can reduce absence and stress arising from conflict at work because we can deal with things sooner rather than later. And most importantly, working relationships are maintained. Employees stay in their jobs and they get back to being productive members of the team rather than being consumed by a conflict that they're involved in. So that concludes my section on mediation. I really hope that you found it useful. I know that a number of questions have come in, so I'm going to hand back to Sue so that we can get them answered for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Sue, are you there?
So sorry, I left myself on mute. Doing well today. Thank you, Victoria.
Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you very much to Kelly. That was really, really interesting and very helpful. I said it's not very often, I don't think, that people take the time to understand the formal mediation process. They might think that they're mediating just by coordinating a conversation, whereas there's a lot more to it than that. One of the questions that we had through was, can you use mediation techniques if you're not a qualified mediator? This came in before your last slide, Kelly, so I'm hoping that you've perhaps convinced them that the external process is quite different and is more likely to be successful, I think you would say, wouldn't you, because of the fact it is somebody independent of the employer and who doesn't know the people in question, so there is absolutely no bias whatsoever in the process.
Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, for sure, mediation techniques can be used by anybody, you know, and it's, you know, may even use them in the process of managing your employees. But when it comes to resolving a dispute or perhaps a lengthy conflict or a complex conflict between some people, then it's probably better to not just have a go, but to get somebody in who's experienced and qualified to handle that for you so that it can be done properly, so to speak.
Absolutely, thank you. So one of the questions we've had through is, do you have to take part in mediation?
Okay, well, no, parties don't have to, it's voluntary. So if they are absolutely against it, and that might be for all manner of reasons, it might be because they're objecting to something that's happening in the process, or they feel worried about going to the room with the other person, I would attempt to not to talk to them, to persuade them, to promote the benefits. But at the end of the day, it is the employee's decision, and if they really don't want to take part, then they don't have to.
Okay, thank you. And I know you talked a bit in the presentation about who knows what, and covering off, you know, who knows what is said in mediation. But I think you said that it's limited, depending on what they allow, what the parties agree to allow to be disclosed.
Yeah, very much so. It is traditionally and technically the case that only the two parties involved will know what was discussed, and of course the mediator. Nothing's going to be passed on to the employer unless they want it to be. And sometimes it is relevant that the mediation agreement is shared with a trusted third party. Perhaps if the parties feel that they don't quite trust the other person to stick to it, then they might both consent to sharing that agreement. But it tends to be the exception rather than the norm. It's usually the case that only the two parties know what's on the mediation agreement and what is said in the mediation.
Okay, thank you. Can you bring a representative to mediation? That's an interesting one, actually.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the answer really, from my point of view, is no. It wouldn't be appropriate. The mediation is an informal process, and it really works best when there's just the two people involved there and the mediator. If you're bringing representatives in, then the other person needs to bring a representative, and then suddenly it becomes more formal, and it just doesn't work. So from an ethical point of view, I wouldn't go ahead if parties wanted to bring representatives with them.
Okay, thank you. And what about if one of the parties doesn't want to be in the same room as the other person? Have you ever had that one?
Well, to be fair, I haven't had that, because we're usually able to talk about that in the individual meeting, and we talk about how we will agree ground rules, how the mediator is there to look after and support both parties within the meeting. And I always make it very clear that if they are unhappy or uncomfortable at any point, they can ask for the mediation to be stopped at any time. So I've never actually had it where they won't go in the same room as one another. Although if that really was the case, it could be possible that the mediator could work between two rooms. But at the end of the day, if the parties need to work together going forward, then for me, they do need to be able to come into the same room and sit down across the table for one another. So I would endeavour to work with them to become comfortable with that and enable that to happen.
Makes sense. A couple around the agreement. So one is, can an individual be made to keep to an agreement reached in mediation?
Yeah, well, the agreement in mediation is morally binding. It's not legally binding. So they're not going to be forced into making an agreement against their wishes. So that's why I spend quite a lot of time in mediation on that section, when the parties are ready to reach agreement, really looking at what will work for you, what's realistic, What do you actually want? You know, what's going to be the right thing? So we work hard on that. So when it comes to the agreement, they want to keep to it. So because it's morally binding, you can't be forced.
Okay, and the other context to that is what happens if you can't reach agreement?
Yeah, so mediation doesn't work in every situation, and if it's the case that the parties can't reach agreement, then I let them know that they can still use their workplace formal procedures to go forward. So taking part in mediation doesn't mean they waive their right to raise a grievance in the future, but they do need to know that they can't bring up anything that has been said in the mediation, anything new that was not already known. And sometimes I would record on an agreement what was not agreed.
Okay.
So sometimes that can be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. I've got one final mediation question, which is interesting one. Does using mediation help companies show they took all steps to resolve a problem at a tribunal stage, or can't it be brought up that you tried to use it at all because of the confidentiality?
Okay. Well, it does help, definitely. It can be brought up, but I will send an email after the mediation to confirm that agreement was reached or agreement was not reached. So that exists, and that can be submitted as evidence to a tribunal, but I can't be called as a witness, and we can't go into what was discussed within the mediation, and the tribunal themselves are well aware of mediation, and so they're not going to ask that question or ask for that evidence anyway. But certainly it does show that you've done all that was reasonably practicable to try to sort out the situation. Yeah,
and I guess it could be a useful precursor to an SOSR discussion that
yes.
You had tried absolutely everything, including mediation, and unfortunately the only option left to you is to do a termination of one of the parties or both of the parties.
Yes.
For the sake of the business going forward. Yeah. Thankfully, we don't get many of those situations, but they do crop up. So I've got an HR question for you, Victoria.
Okay.
Kelly, if you're feeling brave. We've got somebody who raised a grievance about a colleague, but then that colleague put in a counter grievance in response. So how on earth do you unpick that tangled web?
Doesn't sound like a good web, that, does it? It's so I guess first of all, both parties have the right to have their grievance dealt with, but obviously it's getting a little bit messy. I would say the immediate thing is to actually see if mediation actually is probably would work as the initial step in trying to get to the bottom of it, rather than setting up formal hearings. I guess my view is the first step would be to have a conversation with both parties, because obviously both parties have a right to know that there's a complaint against them, and have that conversation to say, look, this is a situation. Are you aware that we can offer mediation, and have the same conversation with both parties separately? And you could put forward an option, an action plan of, okay, we know there's these concerns on both sides. We could look to facilitate mediation by an external party, but obviously you've got to be in agreement and want to do that. And obviously you've raised your grievance, but if at the end of that mediation, then of course we can continue with getting a resolution to that formal grievance, because obviously legally they've submitted a statutory grievance. And so if you are going to probably go down that avenue, try and get the agreement to do mediation first before dealing with any formal grievance, if there is going to be one, because hopefully mediation might stop that, then get that summarised in writing. So you'd want to definitely follow up in writing, say further to the letter of, in which you set out grievances, having a discussion, and options available. You're happy to take part in mediation before considering whether you proceed with the formal grievance process. That's probably what my take would be, and hope that mediation then can resolve it. I mean, obviously it depends on what the grievances are about, I guess, but I think you could put forward that option. hope that's probably the preferred option by both parties, because if they don't want the mediation, then it is going to get a bit of a mess with sorting out grievances. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Sue, but that are different to that, but I would try and get the mediation as your first course of action as an action plan.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the grievances are and at what level they're at. If it's personal between the two, or if it's just both have got different evidence and there's just there's probably only one way forward, and that's for them to agree, to either agree to disagree or to agree on a way forward. So yeah, I think probably that's
okay.
The best way forward. So I've got an interesting question now, and both to do with bullying, and it's probably a mixture of both of you here. So we've got a question about, although the mediator is impartial, are they duty bound to report a legal issue, for example, if they witness bullying or discrimination, against, would you use mediation for allegations of bullying? Do you want to start, Kelly, and perhaps Victoria can?
Well, I would say, I have say in my experience, absolutely yes. And I've dealt with many mediations involving bullying of a serious nature. So yes, definitely. In terms of, are we duty bound to report, is that if something happens within the mediation?
I assume that's what they're meaning, yes.
Well, the mediator
if they
would
witness it. It says if the mediator witnesses, yeah.
Yeah, the mediator would deal with that within the mediation, but they would not be duty bound to report that to the employer, because they it rarely happens, because we set the ground rules. We're very clear. We would nip things in the bud if anything like that was going to happen. But the contents of the mediation, the discussion, are completely confidential. If it was something incredibly serious that happened, I think personally, my take would be that I would stop the mediation, and I probably would report that, because I would stop, but I would let the parties know that was what I was going to do. But it's never ever happened to me. Usually, if parties are coming into the mediation room, they want resolution, they want to sort things out. So I have never in my 13 years of mediating ever had anything like that happen.
Probably good thing, yeah. And I guess, Victoria, this is probably, the mediation is possibly come out of the end of a process anyway.
Yeah.
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. Rather than it kind of happen in the middle of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so the employer will have already identified and come to a conclusion as to allegations and suggested way forwards as an outcome from that process, mediation being one of them. So yeah, it's difficult to know without the full details, but yeah, I agree with everything Kelly's just said around there about the mediation side of things.
Thank you. Well, thank you both. That is been really helpful. That concludes all the questions that we've had. If you do think of any after the webinar, then please do send them through on our inquiries email that you'll see on the slide, and you will get a copy of the slides plus a link to a recording of the webinar in due course. It won't come this afternoon because it takes us a while to process it, but you will get it in the next day or so. We've got one or two things just to let you know. So we do have a formal mediation service using Kelly's services. So if you are interested in discussing any cases with us, with Kelly, then please contact us. That's our number on there. There's also information via our website as well. We also do offer mental health training, and this is the proper first aiders for mental health qualification. So you get a certificate at the end of it, which can help with providing contacts in the workplace who are suitably trained to handle any concerns that employees might have. Also, we work with a partner to deliver EAP support, which can be quite useful. So if you are interested in finding out more about that, then again, do contact us. And also it's available on our website, as you'll see the link there. And finally, we have a third party that we work with as well on called Engagement Multiplier. This can be useful if you've got some general kind of unhappiness within the organisation, not necessarily just one or two people, but if you've got a few little groups or a team perhaps, then Engagement Multiplier is a tool you can use to do a survey with your staff, asking some honest questions, and they provide you with some really good standard questions that you can adopt or adapt as you wish. And you submit the survey to the team, you ask them for feedback on what they want to see, what their concerns are, and it gives you a list of all the potential actions that you should consider coming out of that survey. And then if you implement some of those actions, you can redo the survey in a month or so's time, or in 2 or 3 months' time, and see whether your engagement score has improved. And it's a really good indicator that the things you are doing are actually hitting the nail on the head, or perhaps you haven't done enough of the actions that came out of the one survey, and you need to do more. So it helps you focus your time on things that employees actually value and would perceive to be the organisation listening to them and not just ignoring them, than things that you think they would value. So it is a very effective. We've used it ourselves and find it really handy. And if you want a free trial, they're offering, I think it's their working from home one, on a free trial basis. So again, contact us if that's something you would like to try out. Some of you might have heard about the Kickstart scheme that's been launched recently. This is just to let you know that we are offering a deal on our Fixer recruitment if you are interested in recruiting for that scheme. We've also got some more information and have done a webinar on that as well. And if you are still working on your plans for reorganising or restructuring or rebuilding following the lockdown period and all the challenges of furlough, then we do have a review service that we can offer you as well. So again, more information is on our website, but also contact us. The webinars that's coming up at the moment, we've got 3 booked in, but there will be more. I can assure you there will be more. It also depends on what the government decide to release next. So we've got Brexit coming up in October. There's already a significant registration for that one. We've got a health and safety at work. Dom, our new health and safety manager, he's currently drafting a whole range of health and safety webinars, but he's got one coming up in October on statutory compliance. And then we've got another one on right to work and the new points-based immigration system in November, hoping that by then the government will have perhaps finalised all their changes to it. We can hope. And then if you'd like to keep abreast of all the things as they happen and all the news as it happens, then do sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. And just to remind you that our webinars are all recorded, and there's quite an extensive webinar library now that you have access to via our main website. As always, we welcome your feedback, and if you do have any suggestions for future topics you would like us to present on, then please do let us know. Finally, I would just like to say a huge thanks to Kelly for joining us today. It's been really lovely having you, and a very informative presentation, and also to Victoria for helping with the grievance and disciplinary side of conflict, and for also both of you for fielding the questions, of course. So thank you to you all for attending, and we look forward to meeting you virtually and future ones. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.